Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Rhett Buttle. I have the immense privilege of leading the economic content track at the Aspen Ideas Festival this year, Prosperity Reimagined. And we've already had so many amazing conversations about the future of the economy over the past few days, and we're here to have another one, so I'm very excited about it. We're going to be talking a little bit about something that's been in the public zeitgeist just a little bit. Trade and Tariff Wars is the name of the session, and before I turn it over to our amazing moderator, I just want to get a sense from the audience, so if you could raise your hand. Who in the audience is generally supportive of what President Trump has been doing on trade and tariff wars? Raise your hand if that's the case. Okay, just a few folks. Okay. Who feels like President Trump is completely taking us in the wrong direction on trade and tariffs? Please raise your hands. Okay. And who is just not sure and is here to learn more? All right. So we have some opportunity. And just so you know, when I was designing the content this year, I've been really intentional about creating contrarian voices and making sure that we have a wide variety of points, and that's what we're going to hear on the panel today. So with no further ado, it is my pleasure to turn the conversation over to an amazing woman I've had the pleasure of been working with over the last few months on the content, Jillian Tett. She's with the Financial Times, and she is also the head of the College of King's College in Oxford.
Cambridge.
Okay. In the earlier session, someone gave her the wrong title, and then I was like, I can't say the wrong title. So anyway, Jillian, over to you.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, and delighted to be here with the audience as well, and such a great panel to talk about this topic. A few years ago, Fred Hochberg, a friend of mine who used to run Exim Bank, wrote a book with the wonderful title, Trade is Not a Four-Letter Word. And at the time, I thought, gosh, that's overstating it a bit. But, of course, that was then. Because most of us have grown up in an era where it looked as if free trade was something that was very good. It was baked into much of the policy making of the neoliberal world. We're now living in a very different world where President Trump has come in and ripped up most of the principles around the previous trade policy with tariffs, with all kinds of protectionist moves. We saw just today what he's done with Canada in suspending the trade talks with Canada. But in many ways, Trump is as much a symptom as a cause of a wider zeitgeist shift. So what we're going to do today is have a discussion about whether free trade is indeed a good thing or not, whether it's something that America should or should not be embracing, or whether we are in fact correct to be saying, as Donald Trump is saying, that we need to shift tack radically on trade policy. And we have a variety of views on the panel. At my far left, your right, is Ian Fletcher, an economist who says he's a lapsed Republican who has written not just a book with the person immediately on my left, Mark Fastow, calling for an industrial policy in America, a very good book, I recommend it to you all, but also previously wrote a book, remind me of the title again, Ian?
Free trade doesn't work.
Free trade doesn't work. Well, so you know where he stands on this, okay? And I'll just say he wrote that book way before Bob Lighthizer and others started to basically bang the drum on that. And his ideas, along with Mark Fastow, have very much rippled through the discussion in Washington today, although they're not part of the administration, but it's impacted, or it's laid the ground for a lot of the current policy debates. Mark Fastow, immediately on my left, has worked with Ian for a long time, but interestingly is a Democrat, and also looks at industrial policy and what he would regard as the shortcomings of free trade through a very similar lens, although they're on different sides of the aisle. We have Mike Froman, known to many of you as now the president of the Council for Foreign Relations, where he has to be gloriously bipartisan. However, previously served in a Democrat administration as USTR. So he's been up to his eyeballs in trade and pushing for many trade deals, and previously seemingly a believer in free trade, although we'll hear whether or not his views have changed. And we have Zanny Minto-Beddoes, who's the editor of The Economist, which is a publication that was originally founded to champion free trade and free markets. And in the last, is 140 years of history?
183.
Sorry, 183 years of history, not quite as old as America, but not far off, has been basically sticking to that line very strongly. So let's start then with you, Ian. Can you give us the quick elevator pitch, and I mean like 2 or 3 minutes, on what is wrong, in your view, with the idea of free trade as far as America is concerned? Why should America be putting down these tariffs and all these other protectionist measures today?
Well, I think the first fact that you have to begin with is that free trade, whether it's a good or a bad thing, is simply a fictional construct. It does not exist. It never has existed. The only way it ever could exist is if the entire world were under a one-world government of omnipotent power and Solomonic wisdom. The reality is we live in a mercantilist world where playing the game for one's own benefit is the natural response to the economic facts that every nation faces. And it's not time to walk away from trade per se, which obviously has many benefits, but it's time for the United States to understand that instead of seeking to perfect an economic equilibrium where the free market will automatically give us and everyone else the best possible outcome, we need to understand that we're in a structural condition of rivalry, and we need to learn how to play that game so that we win.
So just to come to Mark, you would argue, or both of you argue, that adopting protectionist trade policies, be that with tariffs or other measures, should not be viewed just in isolation, but part of a bigger program of industrial policy. Again, give us a 2-minute pitch of what you're arguing.
Exactly right. So I got into it by thinking about trade first, and after a while, it became clear to me, what trade policy do you want? Well, you want a trade policy which serves your overall economic strategy. So you have to have an overall economic strategy. We call it industrial policy. You can call it whatever you want, but basically it has 3 pillars. The first is some industries are worth a lot more than others, and you want to focus your industrial policy on those industries. And then number 2, you have to support those industries domestically, research, subsidies, and other forms of support, all the way through to commercializing new technologies. That's part of it. NIH, so for example, National Science Foundation. The second is you have to protect those industries so they don't get subsidized away. We've lost many, many industries, a lot of, 3 million manufacturing jobs, in this country from trade. And the last one is you have to get the currency right. We have an overvalued currency on average now on a trade-weighted basis. It's about 20% overvalued. That's a huge headwind against all these other policies. So you have to have measures to deal with all 3 of these pillars of what we call the pillars of industrial policy, and they need to be coordinated.
Right. So in essence, the argument against free trade, or the mirage of free trade, is one, it's been a complete mirage. In fact, other countries have been mercantilists, so if America has to be mercantilist too, because we're in a world of rivalries, and because of that, we need to view it as part of an industrial policy package which identifies which industries we want to protect, provide ways to protect them to the max, but also then recognize that we have to look at currency, not just movement of goods, and that matters too. So that's effectively your argument. And many aspects of that, of course, are now rippling through the Council of Economic Advisors and other parts of economic policy making around President Trump. Just before I turn to Zanny to give the counter-argument, do you two broadly agree with what President Trump is doing right now, or do you think it's only part of the solution? I mean, Ian, what would you say?
The Trump administration has been a very mixed bag with respect to the things that Mark and I believe in. Obviously, Trump kicked in the door on free trade in 2016, which was an action that was vindicated, I think, by President Biden continuing most of Trump's policies, indeed doubling down. In terms of where the present negotiations to arrive at a new trading regime, in terms of what America's tariffs will be and on whom, we don't know the outcome of that yet. It's an ugly process, but quite honestly, it took us decades to get into this mess, so I don't see how getting out of it could have been anything else.
Right. I mean, one point quickly, Mark, you've often made is that thus far the focus has been on tariffs as part of industrial policy, things like investing in science and research around important industrial sectors, of course, that one is being smashed apart by Trump.
That one's going backwards, exactly in the wrong direction. The prize industrial policies that we have, like NIH, which produces all the new drugs, almost all in the world, the National Science Foundation, and even labs in the armed forces departments are having their budgets cut. That is absolutely counterproductive. So that's wrong. On the tariff front, there's a fair amount of work being done on tariffs on specific industries, which could make sense. That work is more or less, it's not secret, but it needs to be developed. But these very broad tariffs at very high levels, not very productive
Right.
At all.
Right. So, Zanny, you basically think these two are mad.
No, I don't. No, I don't think they're mad. And in fact, I listened to a podcast. I confess I haven't read your book, but I did listen to you both talking about your book, and I actually agree with quite a lot of what you say. But let me give, and I feel now like the sort of heretic outsider in most of these conversations. 10 years ago, when I started this job, it was, as you say, conventional wisdom that freer trade was the norm. Now, I'm usually the only person on a panel, so I kind of think you're half on my side. But anyway...
Mike is paid to be a diplomat.
The case for fewer trade barriers, and let us start by saying total free trade is not where we have ever been, but the case for freer trade barriers, for fewer barriers, in theory, I think you all know, which is that it makes economies more efficient, tariffs are taxes on consumers, and it increases the size of the overall pie in a way that, in theory, you can make everyone better off. Historically, if we look at the post-1945 period, when there was the multilateral trade system put in place and systematically barriers were reduced, we have seen the greatest period of global poverty reduction in history. And there is quite strong evidence that these two things are not just correlations, that there is causation going from one to the other. But then the question is, not everybody wins. And when you were USTR and I was trade correspondent writing about it, in the 1990s in the US, when
you were based in Washington before,
I was based in Washington. When China entered the WTO, there was a huge shock that hit the US economy and had an incredible impact on US workers. It wasn't just trade, it was also technology. I happen to think that technology had a bigger impact, but the two things together meant that there were a lot of losers in the US economy. And not enough was done to help those people. And we could have a long discussion about that, but I think the politics of trade in this country stems from the fact that there was a slightly Pollyanna-ish view from people like me and people like the administrations you served in, that not enough needed to be done to assist the people who were displaced by trade and who were hurt by trade. But then, and this is where I part company with the two of you, we are where we are, is the answer to now impose tariffs across the board? And my answer is absolutely not, because you hurt consumers, you make the economy less efficient, and you don't achieve what you want to achieve, which is to bring back jobs to the United States for the many Americans who only have a high school education. Because if you look at manufacturing in the United States right now, 10% of all Americans work in manufacturing. A third of those are people with high school degrees and not with degrees. And if you put tariffs on, you will hurt consumers, pretty much everybody, you will make the US less efficient, and you will not bring back jobs for the people that you're trying to help. In fact, you will make life much harder for the people you're trying to help. So for me, this is not so much a conversation about the principles, although I would be sacked if I didn't believe in this, and I do fervently believe in the benefits of trade. But in the context of the US right now, what I think is completely tragic is that going down this direction is exactly what is not going to help the very people that you all say you want to help. Instead, the US, as a rich country with a lot of high-skilled jobs, should be doubling down on its strengths, which is its strong capital markets, its higher education, its skills, it's at the cutting edge of technology. That's where the US will win. And the kinds of jobs that people with high school education and no more will be there'll be the skilled trades, there'll be the electricians building the data centers, there'll be the people working in plenty of jobs that AI will not take. But this is not going to be helped by putting up tariff walls around the United States.
So would you...
The Aspen consensus has spoken.
Okay. Well, I can see I'm going to give Ian, by the way, we've very carefully balanced this panel, so it's basically fairly equal in the views. but apart from over-indexing on British females, but never mind. But before we go on to Mike, are there any parts of the American economy that you would protect today in terms of, from foreign competition?
So there are three main reasons given for this current set of industrial policies. One is to bring back jobs for regular Americans. The second is to essentially be there for national security reasons, to prevent dangerous reliance on China, which is a nasty authoritarian regime that is also an economic competitor. And I happen to think that that is actually a defensible goal. However, the way I think it is best done is by the United States, together with its allies, thinking about where is the most efficient place in the broader non-China world to have those critical minerals, to have those industries. And instead, what the United States is doing, to wit the president today, putting up tariffs against your nearest and closest trading partner. So yes, there are reasons, and in the previous administration it was called the narrow yard, high fence approach. Small yard, high fence. You would have a small number of things that you would protect. I used to have disagreements with the previous administration because I think the problem with having small yards and high fences is that fences get higher and yards get bigger. And even during this administration, the yard got ever bigger because it suddenly all kinds of things became critical for national security. But I do think there are a few things that are absolutely central that you would want to make sure you had access to for national security reasons.
Right. I guess the question is how to identify those. But Mike, you were previously head of USTR. Do you have any regrets?
Absolutely.
Is there anything that you'd have done differently?
So first of all, of course, I agree.
You went around the world, banging in the drum for things like TTP. That was the abortive effort to get America part of a pan-Asian, pan-Pacific trading deal. You were constantly championing free trade in different guises and trying to persuade people to adopt sustainable, responsible trade. In many ways, you are part of the problem in the eyes of people like Ian and Mark.
It's good to be here too, Julia. Thanks for including me.
In the eyes of people like Mark and Ian, you are.
First of all, I agree, not surprisingly, I agree with everybody on the panel.
You can't.
We like Mike.
To a certain degree. Okay. First of all, I agree mostly with Zanny, but there are elements of agreement with Ian and Mark as well. Look, I think to answer your question directly, I think that the benefits of freer trade, and as Ian said, it's never been free, and we have been among the most protectionist in certain areas, as some other countries. But the benefits, I think, are really incontrovertible. And where we have failed as a country, Republican and Democratic administrations together over the decades, is in recognizing the distributional consequences, the speed and the impact of particularly China's entry as the manufacturing foundation of the global economy on specific communities, and the failure of new investment in new industries and the creative destructionism to take place in Youngstown, Ohio in a relevant time frame, and the impact of that out in the community. And that is, so the regret I have is that I never successfully convinced my colleagues that we needed a robust domestic policy to go along with trade policy to address lifelong learning, place-based economic development, innovation in places spread out around the rest of the country, and to deal with the fact that, and to deal frankly with the fact that there were some winners and there were some people who did not win.
So essentially you think that your trade policies were right, the rest of the policies were wrong?
Well, I think that the trade policy alone was not enough, and it needed to be a more comprehensive policy. And frankly, I had hopes that President Trump, representing a lot of people who felt alienated and displaced by the previous administration's policies, would take this on and would say, we really care about these workers who have become alienated, the communities that have been left behind, and we're going to do something concrete about it. And thus far, that's not, that has not happened. It didn't happen in the first term, and so far it's not happening in the second term as well. I do think that there is a role for tariffs. There's always been a role for tariffs, for example, in the context of unfair trade. When you can't get a country to change its policies, you may need to use tariffs to balance things out. And I think that's one of the challenges. But I think we'd all agree, including, I assume, Ian and Mark, that tariffs alone are not going to achieve what the administration is seeking to achieve, and whether it's research and development or industrial policy. And the question is, can we engage in industrial policy as a country sufficiently? For years, we tried to convince China not to be protectionist, not to subsidize their exports and not to restrict foreign investment. And now we are protectionist, we are subsidizing our industry, and we are restricting our foreign investment. Rather than making China more like us, we have become Chinese. And can we compete with China on China's terms? Because the previous approach had been to try and define, through US leadership, the rules of the road of the global economy in ways that reflected US interests and US values, and now we're playing on their chessboard. And I'm not convinced we can do so. Even this administration that very much wants to reindustrialize America has come out in many ways against the CHIPS Act, against the IRA. We're talking a little bit about shipbuilding, and it goes to the question that Zanny mentioned, the slippery slope. We do need limiting principles about how far and where we're going to do industrial policy. Otherwise, it just becomes another excuse for any protected industry. So are pharmaceuticals an area where we might want to have industrial policy? When I say industrial policy, it becomes some combination of protection and subsidization. Maybe, or some incentives. Maybe because we are 100% dependent on China for the active ingredients that go into our pharmaceuticals. Shipbuilding, is that an area? Maybe. But I was with an administration official the other day, and I asked him, do we need to put tariffs on clothing? Like, do we need to make clothing in the United States? And he said, even soldiers wear uniforms. And I don't want our soldiers wearing foreign clothing. So I think this can go too far. And I think the issue, and Zanny alluded to it, isn't this the case to look at where can we partner with allies and partners and see where it makes sense to produce all those things where we don't want to have a single dependency on China, whether it's because of national security or the extended supply chains. We shouldn't want to have, by the way, single dependency on any market, including the United States. Because we've seen when there's a disruption, what's the number one tool of risk management? Diversification. You don't want to be dependent on one place, let alone China, let alone specifically around national security. The question is, how far does that go?
Well, that is very ironic. I often think the policy seems to be, as far as Southeast Asia is concerned, if you can't beat them, join them, to go back to the point that America's becoming more Chinese in its policy making, not the other way around. Sorry, Mark, I see you want to come in.
Yeah, we're in agreement on that, and it's actually almost a rule of nature that people will do what China is doing, not as well, not as with the same resources, and not as crudely and brutally, but that's the way of the world. The U.S. and the U.K. are the only two developed countries that really even believe in free markets. Everybody else says, yeah, we believe in it, because they want access to our markets.
Well, Zanny, I can see you
Can I assure you,
No,
I spend my time
let me make another point,
around.
a related point.
Okay, make your point then, Zanny. Okay.
So after every major free trade agreement we've entered into, considering China's entering into the WTO as the equivalent, all the projections have been that our trade deficit with those countries will go down. Exactly the opposite has happened. It's just made it easier for them to import into our country, and they just have 1 million non-tariff trade barriers, or they devalue their currencies. So that's the way of the world. I think that we should all acknowledge that every country is going to, and it's legitimate for it to protect its most advanced or important industries. That's what's going to happen. We need to wake up and play the game, which is kind of what you just said.
Well, Zanny, let me say...
That's a good idea, by the way.
Okay.
Just a couple of responses. First, as a matter of fact, I spend my life going around talking to policymakers around the world, and I can assure you that most policymakers in most countries are aghast at what the United States is doing, and they are saying, why is the United States giving up on the multilateral trade system? Why are we the only people who still believe in it? And it is not just the United States and the UK. There are a lot of other countries who believe in multilateral trade and who want to continue this system.
They say that.
Yeah, and they actually behave in that way. So that,
Really?
And the second point is to your point about the broader trade deficit. The reason the United States runs a large current account deficit is because the United States spends more than it saves. And the reason it spends more than it saves, one big reason, is because it's running a 6% of GDP budget deficit, which is about to get even bigger. The United States is not going to balance its trade through raising tariffs until it changes its basic savings investment pattern.
So, Mike, as I say, we've arranged it carefully so that you two are the sort of the ham in the sandwich, surrounded by the other side. But, Mike, I'd like to ask you, what do you think is going to happen if the Trump administration carries on with this rather chaotic, unpredictable approach towards tariffs and protectionism? Do you think that basically means the WTO is dead? Do you think that other countries will simply say, okay, America exists in a land of its own, and other countries will just trade with each other a lot more?
So I do think the WTO is dead. I think if you look at all the functions that the WTO was set up to do, negotiate agreements, monitor countries' trade policies, and resolve disputes, none of them are working. And they're not going to work without the U.S. demonstrating leadership, and we're not going to be doing that. So other countries may decide to still live by the rules and create quasi-WTO mechanisms. I think we're heading towards a world, and I'm not sure this is it's a second best world, but from an economic efficiency point of view, I'm not sure it's a terrible world of open plurilateralism, where coalitions.
Is that again?
Open plurilateralism. So
plurilateralism.
multilateralism
I bet you
is
practice
dead.
saying that. That's quite a mouthful.
Open plurilateralism,
Plurilateralism.
meaning
It's going to be a headline.
coalitions of you get to decide the headline. So coalitions of the willing come together, coalitions of the ambitious around particular issues. For some, it may be trade liberalization. CPTPP continues to grow. The UK has joined it. For some, it may be a set of rules around industrial policy. We've agreed we're all going to engage in industrial policy, but we want to do it in a less beggar thy neighbor fashion. We wanted some rules of the road. We want to do it together. We want to take advantage of each other's comparative advantages. It may be around that. It may be around a common policy towards China, or a common policy in support of our national security objectives. So I think countries coming together, which makes it more fragmented, and by the way, more expensive. We're going to be living in a more expensive world. For decades, our whole system, and in fact the field of economics, was all based on the value of efficiency. What we've learned over the last several years, not just because of China, but because of COVID, because of Fukushima, because of all sorts of factors, we need to look at supply chains not just from a perspective of efficiency, but from resilience, redundancy, diversification, national security. And that means we need to be willing to pay a price. It's going to be more expensive than it has been. And you ask what the costs are. Well, the costs are low-wage consumers, to Zanny's point, are going to pay more. People who can least afford to pay it are going to pay more. Nobody leaves Walmart and says, thank God for the WTO and the Uruguay Round Agreement. Because I can fill my basket with everything I need for my family for a reasonable percentage of my paycheck. But that's exactly what's happening, and that's going to become more expensive. And so there, I think, is the number one cost. And there may be trade-offs that we have to say that's worth paying. For national security, we think it's important that the low-wage consumer pay more for certain goods. That may be worth paying, but for everything, no.
Ian, do you think that this new trade policy will make things more expensive for ordinary people? And would you slap tariffs on T-shirts, or would you slap tariffs on Canada?
Okay. I wouldn't impose tariffs on goods like T-shirts, which there's no particular reason why we want that industry in the United States. It has a low value added per man hour. It's based mainly on cheap labor. It's not a desirable industry for us. But there's a larger issue that I'd like to address with these folks and a lot of people I talk to about trade and protectionism. I keep hearing people defending trade with very good arguments, and then they try and claim that they have defended free trade. They're not the same thing. So I suggest to the audience, whenever you hear an argument that is supposedly an argument for free trade, you got to ask, is this really just an argument for trade? And I'll give you one example. If you look at the fact, which Zanny pointed out a few minutes ago, that China, supposedly thanks to free trade, had been able to raise the living standards of hundreds of millions of its people. Well, no, actually, China didn't make all those formerly starving peasants affluent, or more affluent than they were, by practicing free trade. China did it by practicing mercantilism very successfully in a global environment in which the American market was propped over by our misunderstood policy of free trade. But China did it with mercantilism. That's how the poor people got lifted out of poverty.
I can see that Mike is dying to jump in here and disagree.
Well, yeah. I mean, look, I think as a former USTR, this is somewhat heretical, but I think trade agreements get far too much credit and far too much blame for what's going on in the world. And people conflate free trade agreements with globalization. If you want to blame somebody for the impact on the American manufacturing, blame the person who invented the container. Because it was the invention of the container which allowed manufacturing to move all over the world and to have supply chains be sited there. It's the invention of broadband and the spread of broadband that allowed services to be outsourced to places like India or the Philippines. So you could have a customer service operation outside the United States. Technology, most economists think it's about 80% of the impact, where trade might be about 20% of the impact on manufacturing. But you don't get to vote on software. You don't get to vote on technology. You get to vote on things where we get to point the finger at the foreigner and say it's trade, it's immigration, right? We don't say it's our software, it's our latest invention that we really like, and therefore that becomes the scapegoat for quite understandable economic anxiety. The other thing I would say, again, we've never had free trade with China. Let's just be clear. U.S. manufacturing has declined over the last several decades, just as it has declined in Germany. The lines are absolutely parallel. Germany's seen as a great manufacturing success, and we're this disaster. Yeah, so, and that's, again, has much more to do with how advanced industrial economies evolve and evolve from industrial to service-related economies and the like. And look at what's happening now. I mean, you think we were in this disastrous country from the rhetoric around this issue. 75% of all global market cap is American companies. Like, we are the driver of all of this innovation. And it has not been lost on the rest of the world that our model is fundamentally working, that they can't understand why we're shooting ourselves in the foot on R&D and investment and innovation and the killing of our universities and the things of that sort. So anyway, just a long way of saying it's not all about free trade agreements.
Right.
Globalization, technology, other issues.
In a moment. I can see both Zanny and Mark want to come in.
Tiny little, because I completely agree with everything you said, and I just want to add one thing, which is people say manufacturing has declined. It's important to remember the US produces more manufactured goods in real terms now than it has ever done. It's just manufacturing jobs have declined because manufacturing in the US is incredibly productive and getting more so. And that's why globally the share of jobs in manufacturing is declining. China has seen a huge decline in the number of people working in manufacturing. What happens as you get richer, you become more productive, you use machinery better. And so what we're really talking about, I think what the two of you are talking about is not manufacturing output, you're talking about jobs, right?
No, we're talking about manufacturing output as well. If you take out semiconductors and the related products, US manufacturing output is pretty much flat since the late 90s.
I don't want to jump into being the moderator here, but can I ask you why, as economies get richer, they tend to move more into services because that's what people want to consume?
Sure.
So why is this a bad thing?
Well, that's not a bad thing, but for the United States, 10 years ago, it made about 78% in value of the manufacturers that it consumed. Now it's 68%. That's relative. It doesn't matter whether manufacturing overall has declined or not. That's what we've lost. That's $790 billion worth of value.
But can we agree, I think we're in agreement, that this policy on reindustrialization is about increasing the amount we produce, not about the jobs, because the factories that are likely to be built in the United States are likely to be highly automated.
That's true.
You mentioned we lost 3 million manufacturing jobs. That's over about a 20-year period, right? We lose 4 million jobs a year. People change 4 million jobs a year on a normal basis.
Okay.
Yeah, but
so 3 million manufacturing
jobs.
jobs.
It's a great panel where basically I don't have to do anything but let them argue.
Sorry.
This is the best of Aspen when you start having on-stage arguments. But anyway, with Mark, you wanted to say something before I go to the audience?
Say again?
Mark, do you want to say something before I go to the audience? Or Ian?
Yeah. Well,
brief. I'm going to go to the audience in 1 minute, so get ready with your questions. Yeah.
I'd like Ian to take on this comment that Zanny made about how the trade deficit is due to not enough U.S. savings, because that's one we've heard a lot about and we disagree fundamentally about.
Sure. Before I get to that, I'd like to address another issue, which is making technology an excuse to say that the growth in openness to trade, for example, is due to the shipping container, to broadband internet. Well, the problem with that is if you look at economic history, you discover that the issues of protecting an economy in order to build up high-valued manufacturing go back hundreds of years. This is what Alexander Hamilton was concerned about when he told the other founding fathers that if the United States did not develop a tariff-protected economy, we would remain an agricultural colony of Europe. So yes, shipping containers, broadband, and all that are important, but the fundamental dynamic that way nations develop high value-added industries, which historically means manufacturing, and today is a little more than that, this has been a protectionist strategy for hundreds of years despite the technological change. So I don't think it makes sense to use technology as an excuse and say that's what's really going on. The underlying trade dynamics are what's really going on.
Okay, right. Well, on that point, let's go to the audience. In spirit with Aspen, please keep your comments respectful. Please keep them very short and to the point, because I suspect a number of people will want to come in, and it would be courteous but not compulsory to identify yourself very briefly. We got a comment in the front row, and then right at the back over there, and then over there. So let's go 1, 2, 3.
So I totally appreciate the macro. I appreciate the macroeconomic commentary. On the micro side, I've spent my entire career building businesses. I partner with inventors who get patents in the U.S. I usually can't get it made in the U.S., but I can get it made in Italy, Japan, China. Over 30 plus years, I've built businesses worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Tons of people have sales jobs, marketing jobs, distribution jobs, PR jobs. Those businesses would not have existed if I couldn't get it made, and I could never have gotten it made in the United States.
So you're saying basically you need to have trade to
Totally.
drive that growth.
And the jobs that got created were more valuable than the $100 or $200 a month that were paid overseas.
Right.
So that to me is just such a net benefit, and I'm just one guy of millions.
Okay, great comment. I'll do that as a comment, not a question. So let's go back there. And I'm going to try and, it's a very good comment, and I want to get as many voices as possible into the conversation.
So this is an Ian and Mark question, echoing Zanny. Why are we obsessing so much about 12 million manufacturing jobs, 10% of our GDP, when there are 18 million people in the United States who work in tourism? Tariffs are hurting those people at the expense of what? And I guess I would like to hear from both of you. These are trade-offs within an economy that is predominantly service-oriented and predominantly high-end,
Right.
where you seem to be obsessing about industrial policy to the complete abnegation of focusing on what is in fact equally, if not more vibrant in the United States in the past 20 years, and has led to massive GDP growth, which is services.
Right. While you two, do you want to think about, reply straight away, or should I take one more question?
Up to you.
Okay, let's take one more, and then we'll have, there's a question over there, yeah.
I'm a Stanford grad, so I'm aware of this. What do you think is going to be the effect of what's gone on and is going on now in Silicon Valley, south of Stanford, in terms of the explosion of AI, which we've talked about in other things? How is that going to affect trade in the future? Is it going to help, or is it going to be a hindrance?
Great questions. Okay, so do you want to tell us why we need to care about manufacturing jobs when tourism actually employs people?
Right. First of all, manufacturing employment's about 9% of the total job universe. But if you look at the other jobs that feed into manufacturing that exist because of this manufacturing, it's about 21% of jobs. And the same is true for the output. It's about 11 or 12% of the economy. But if you look at all the downstream inputs, it's about 35% of the economy. So even in its diminished state, it's very, very significant. So the second part of the question is, will tariffs have these bad effects? Well, they may or may not, but the basic reason for putting a tariff on is to promote investment in the industry that you're protecting. And all these analyses which focus on, well, will there be price inflation, how much, and so on, generally they're overstated. But put that aside for a minute. We need to look long term. One of the big problems of US economic policy is it's been very short term, including all the analyses of what the effects of tariffs are going to be. None of them, until we started modeling it, take into account the long-term cumulative result of the investment that it fosters. And if you add those up, you clearly, in many situations, not everyone, some things shouldn't be tariffed at all, but if you pick it right, the long-term benefits far exceed whatever price inflation there is. Plus, you've got all that tariff revenue, which you can use directly to offset whatever price inflation effect there is on people who can't bear it the least.
Right. Well, I can see that both Mike and Zanny are waiting to pounce and to strongly disagree. Would any of you like to comment on that, or say how AI is going to impact this or not?
So I will simply say I don't agree with you. I could go in at length why, but I think the interesting thing is to link your response to that very good question about what is happening south of Silicon Valley. My view is that AI is going to be, exponentially more important than anything we're discussing here right now in terms of the future of the US economy. And indeed the future of the global economy. This is a technological shock at least as big as that of the Industrial Revolution. Therefore, the economies that are going to do best in the 21st century are those which adopt AI fastest, diffuse it fastest, and have social policies that enable the entire population to sort of not just survive, but to flourish in this new world. And it seems to me that obsessing about tariffs, putting up tariff barriers, makes the US less efficient and less able to do that. And paradoxically, it will mean that a few companies will actually move towards AI faster, because that will be the only way in which they will be able to remain profitable. And we will have a less socially acceptable transition, and we will spend less time thinking on what we really should be thinking about, which is how do we ensure that the United States is at the forefront of this enormous technological change. So I think where you are is going to determine whether the United States succeeds and prospers in the 21st century. And it has every reason to do incredibly well in this. But it ain't going to be helped by a discussion about tariffs, and it certainly ain't going to be helped by a kind of crude, huge increase in tariffs.
Mike? Well, I must say, I'm very glad I'm not sitting between these two different sides, because I'd be like an umpire in a tennis match going back and forth.
So first of all, what she said. Because I think to the point I was trying to make earlier, we have failed to address the domestic part of and the adjustment part of the equation, and AI is going to dwarf any discussion that we've had around the China shock, trade generally, globalization even, and we better get our act together, or we're really not going to be able to address this in a good way. One thing we haven't talked about is how tariffs hurt manufacturing, not help it. And we have data, we have actual case studies. 2018, Trump put 25% tariffs on steel. 7 years later, we have 1,000 more steel workers than we had in 2018. And we have 75,000 fewer workers in manufacturing in industries that use steel, because steel was expensive and they became uncompetitive. And just multiply that now by multiple sectors. We have a long history with using tariffs for this purpose. It's called import substitution. Argentina was great at it, right? We don't want to be Argentina. Now, we're not Argentina in a lot of ways, but we don't want to be great at it. Last but I'll make, I'm sorry. I think President Trump has got a really interesting challenge on his hands, because the challenge of globalization was that everybody benefited as consumers, and a lot of people benefited as producers. But the benefit was invisible. You didn't feel it. And the costs of globalization were acute and serious, and people lost jobs, and factories closed, and communities fell apart. He's now flipped this on its head. And by imposing tariffs, if he goes through with this, everyone's going to be hurt, and it's going to be quite visible. And the benefits, if he's successful, if he's right, it will come 4, 6, 8 years from now, and will affect relatively few workers in relatively few sectors in relatively few geographies. And that, to me, is a really difficult thing to manage politically. It'll be interesting to see how he does.
Well, to be fair, I would say that the White House economists would argue that, in fact, tariffs didn't raise inflation significantly last time. That's what they argue. Right. And they would also argue, in fact, the long-term impact of it. They dispute many of these analyses, and I can see both Ian and Mark are nodding about this. So, by the way, I should say to everyone in the audience, if you want to get a balanced view of the picture, try reading both The Economist and Mark and Ian's book in the same evening, and that'll give you a good overview. We've got a question.
Foreign affairs.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And of course.
And then get Mike to speak to top it all off.
Okay, we've got a question there, and I want to take a couple more as well, if any more hands go up.
Thank you. The downside to globalization has been recognized largely that there have been people left behind. The workers with a high school degree are those who were harmed by globalization. So I want to understand from Ian and Mark how tariffs will help those people.
Okay, well, the basic premise is that if you want good paying jobs for people with high school education or high school plus some good vocational training, which we need a whole lot more of, and a lot of other countries do much better, where do they come from? Those are manufacturing jobs, even in modern manufacturing. And they're good. They're no longer dirty and unpleasant jobs. These are jobs that pay very well. We have lost so many of these jobs. Some of them won't come back. Some of them, like of the 6 million, let's say 2,000,005 over 20 years, whatever the period is, are lost due to automation and so on. But there are a whole bunch that aren't. So where are you going to get them? Healthcare isn't going to pay. What can expand more? We have a trade deficit in goods of $1,400 billion. You bring back a small percentage of those jobs, and you've got a whole lot of jobs that you can't really get out of any other sort of kinds of sectors in our economy.
Danny, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I honestly don't think that what you have just said reflects the reality of the US economy. If tariffs are put on, and some companies will come back and invest in manufacturing in the US, and they will do so by creating highly automated, capital-intensive plants, which will employ a few very highly skilled engineers. They will not be jobs for high school educated people without a degree. Already, as I said earlier, it's fewer than a third of the people employed in manufacturing have only a high school degree. And anyone that is coming back in will come only back in by having an incredibly automated, probably very AI-driven factory. And so the notion that you are going to recreate Joe Lunch Pail jobs by putting up tariffs, I think it's fantasy. I really do.
Okay, for balance, I'm going to ask Ian and then Mike.
I think there's been a theme in this conversation, not just at this talk, but in the debate generally, where people try to reduce the critique of free trade to basically, it's mean to poor people. Now, to some extent that may be true, but the larger issue, which I think is the really important issue, is whether it's bad for the economy as a whole. And I think it is. And I also observe that we have comments made like, why should we even worry about manufacturing in the US when we have all these other sectors that are doing so well that maybe we can just ignore this? And sure, if you're satisfied with the level of economic performance you have now, maybe you can accept decline in a given sector. I think that the goal of Americans should be to have the best economy we can have, which means that we should have all our sectors should be healthy. And the reason that our book and our political activism has focused on manufacturing is that is the single weakest sector in the United States compared to peer nations. It's the sector where if we do better in that field, we have the best chance of improving our economy overall. We're not going to upgrade our economy by having a much better hospitality sector or an entertainment sector or a medical sector or building housing or whatever. Manufacturing is the laggard. That is where there is the opportunity to do better, And that is where we should be focusing our attention. It's not because free trade is mean to poor people.
Right, okay, Mike, quickly.
I think we have a real issue on the labor front that we need to focus on. We have 400,000 current manufacturing jobs that are open without applicants. We want to have millions more manufacturing jobs potentially under this strategy. That doesn't mean we shouldn't have them, but it means we're going to have to be training people, preparing people, do the vocational training, all of that, which, you know, thus far we have not really seen movement in that direction. You know, as Larry Summers was fond of saying, every coal miner wants their child to work at the airport. Right? They want their child to be out of manufacturing and in a cleaner service-related job. Mark is right. Manufacturing jobs used to pay a premium. And by the way, when you say manufacturing jobs, there's a code word there. You meant union manufacturing jobs. Because non-union manufacturing jobs didn't pay anything more than service jobs. But that has recently flipped. And the manufacturing premium is gone. And the average service job now pays more than the average manufacturing job in America.
Right. Well, listen. Unfortunately, we are out of time. I have the feeling this will go on for a very long time. I just want to take away 3 key points. Firstly, that we are, as I said earlier, at a moment of zeitgeist shift, where the idea of neoliberal economics, free market, free trade being good, is no longer dominant, and ideas that actually have been around for a long time, but have been largely ignored by the mainstream, which people like Ian have been putting forward, and Mark are now, in fact, dominating the policy tone in Washington today. So you need, even if you dislike them, you need to listen to them and take them very seriously. Secondly, there is a very, very lively fight intellectually about where policy is going as we embrace this zeitgeist shift, or don't embrace it, rather suffer this zeitgeist shift. And the third point is, we are only going to really know the outcome in several years' time, because the impact of these big policy shifts we're living through, these tariffs and this protectionism, are probably not going to be felt properly for quite a while. If Ian and Mark are correct, we're heading towards a better America with essentially a more vibrant economy. If Zanny and Mike are correct, we're in fact heading to the rocks. We don't yet know.
There's a third outcome, that these tariffs don't actually happen. And that seems to be where we're heading.
Then we'll just keep.
Well, we may also be heading.
Slope.
Exactly. We may also be heading for a lot more muddle, starting with Canada. I don't know if any Canadians in the audience, but certainly that right now epitomizes the muddle and confusion. So I'll just finish by saying, please do both look at Ian and Mark's book. It is a really good description of this intellectual, perspective. Do keep reading The Economist, because you'll get the other opposing perspective. And I think the CFR is trying very bravely, often with great difficulty, to find a middle ground, to which I say good luck. Thank you.